Why did Göbekli Tepe change the course of history? Because that hill forced humanity to question one of its most basic stories. For a long time, the story told by historians, archaeologists, and ordinary people was simple. First, humans learned agriculture. Then they built villages. Then populations grew. Then division of labor appeared. Then religious structures, monuments, and large collective projects were created. In other words, first came bread, then came the temple. First came settled life, then came great ideas. But a rocky hill near Şanlıurfa, in southeastern Anatolia, turned that order upside down. Because the massive stone pillars, carvings, and monumental structures found there made people think. Maybe humans first learned how to gather together. Maybe they first needed a shared belief, a shared ritual, a shared sense of awe and fear. Maybe this sacred place came before the field. That is why Göbekli Tepe is not just an archaeological site. It is a giant question mark thrown into humanity's own story of beginnings. Now imagine it for a moment. No calendars, no writing, no pottery, no metal, no wheel, no cities, no kingdoms. But there are people. And these people are cutting, moving, raising, and carving stones that weigh tons, then placing them in deliberate arrangements on a bare rocky hill. So this is not just a small group of hunters trying to survive. This is a human community that plans, organizes, creates meaning, uses symbols, and works while thinking about the future. That is what makes Göbekli Tepe so shocking. Because those stones show us that people living in the Stone Age had a much more complex mental world than we once imagined. For a long time, we thought the distant past was simple. We called it primitive. We imagined scattered people who could not think beyond daily survival. But the silent stones of Göbekli Tepe say something else. They say, no, the human mind was capable of much greater dreams, much earlier than we thought. Even the name Göbekli Tepe carries a strange sense of mystery. In Turkish, it means potbelly hill, a name that comes from the rounded shape of the rise in the landscape. From the outside, it can look like an ordinary mound. But beneath that soil lies a world that disrupted the order of history books. The structures found there date roughly to the end of the 10th millennium BCE and the beginning of the 9th millennium BCE. That means they are thousands of years older than the Egyptian pyramids, much older than Stonehenge. And the existence of such large stone arrangements at such an early date is astonishing, not only in architectural terms, but also in terms of human organization. Because monumental architecture is usually associated with strong political systems, large populations, specialized labor, and fully developed settled life. Yet Göbekli Tepe forces us to look in the opposite direction. Here, the monument seems to come first. The symbolic world seems to come first. Shared meaning seems to come first. And all of this makes us rethink the basic stages of human development. So why was this place recognized so late? In truth, the region itself was not completely unknown. But for years, its importance was not fully understood. Fragments of stone, rises in the ground, and broken remains were often taken for ordinary traces from later periods. Then people looked again, more carefully, and it became clear that the stones visible near the surface were not just random rocks or simple grave markers. Massive T-shaped pillars began to emerge from the soil. And at that moment, one thought echoed in everyone's mind. There is something extraordinary here. Because these pillars were not only large, they were worked. Some were covered with animal reliefs. Some showed human-like forms, belts, hands, and symbolic details. In other words, these were not just stones. These were stones that had been designed, shaped, and given meaning. In archaeology, sometimes a discovery is not just an object. It is a doorway into the mindset of an age. And Göbekli Tepe was exactly that kind of doorway. One of the most striking features of these pillars is their T-shape. At first glance, they look geometric. But when you look more closely, some of them seem to have been conceived as abstract human figures. Arms, hands, belt-like details. All of this suggests that the stone was not just a structural element. It may also have been a form of representation. In other words, people here may not have simply been building walls. They may have been trying to make the invisible visible. Perhaps they were representing ancestors. Perhaps supernatural beings. Perhaps the collective memory of the community. There is much we still do not know for certain. But one thing is clear. These people did not use stone only to build structures. They used stone to build ideas, to build meaning, to express a worldview. And at the center of that worldview, wild animals seem to have held enormous power. Snakes, foxes, vultures, wild boars, great cats, scorpions. The choice of these animals does not feel accidental, because these are not ordinary decorations from daily life. They may symbolize danger, power, death, fear, and perhaps even sacredness itself. This is exactly where Göbekli Tepe begins to shake our understanding of history. For many years, it was assumed that complex religious thought, large-scale social organization, and monumental architecture could only appear after settled agricultural societies had formed. The logic seemed simple. First, people farm. Then they produce surplus food. Then not everyone has to search for food all day. Some become craftsmen. Some become rulers. Some become priests. Then monuments are built. It was a clean and convincing model of progress. But Göbekli Tepe challenged that model in a serious way. Because the great stone circles and pillars there suggested that hunter-gatherer groups, or communities that had not yet become fully agricultural, could also carry out enormous collective projects. And that raised a powerful possibility. What if the first great force that brought people together was not only hunger, not only economics? What if shared belief, shared ritual, and shared symbols were just as powerful as bread? One of the reasons for this idea comes from the animal bones and traces of wildlife found at the site. For a long time, the evidence did not point clearly to a fully developed farming village based on domesticated herds. Instead, the remains of wild animals drew attention. That led many researchers to think that, at least in its early phases, Göbekli Tepe may have been less like an ordinary settlement and more like a special gathering place where people came together at certain times. In other words, people may not have lived there permanently, but they may have gathered there seasonally or repeatedly. Perhaps they held feasts. Perhaps they performed rituals. Perhaps they carried out ceremonies connected to death. Perhaps different groups met there to renew social bonds. Think about that. Small human groups living separately, coming together in the same sacred place, looking at the same symbols, standing around the same stones, listening to the same stories. This is not just a biological crowd of humans. This is the birth of social imagination. And perhaps the seed of what we call civilization was planted right there. Göbekli Tepe did not only change the order of history, it also changed the way we think about what a human being is. Because modern people often look back at the past and imagine themselves standing at the peak of progress, as if there was first simplicity and only later complexity. But Göbekli Tepe reminds us that complex thought existed very early. These people may not have written mathematics books. They may not have created written law. But they knew how to fill space with meaning. They could arrange stones with intention. They could plan great projects that required shared labor. They could produce symbolic thought. In short, they were not just living humans. They were humans interpreting the world. And perhaps true civilization was being built first in the mind, long before it was built in walls. That is one of Göbekli Tepe's greatest effects. It reminds us that civilization may begin not only with technology, but with the ability to create meaning. One of the most fascinating questions is this: who moved these massive stones? How were they cut? How were they raised? How was the whole thing planned? Because these are not simple support posts for huts. Some pillars are several meters tall and extremely impressive in scale. They are thought to have been quarried from the nearby limestone plateau. That means the work involved not only construction, but quarrying, transport, carving, and placement. So there was serious labor here. Serious investment of time. Serious coordination. How was that possible without a central state? Perhaps there were charismatic leaders. Perhaps a council of elders. Perhaps individuals believed to carry sacred knowledge. Or perhaps the shared belief itself was so powerful that people gathered and worked willingly. We do not know the full answer. But we do know this: something on this scale cannot be explained by chance. A project of this size requires planning and division of labor. That makes Göbekli Tepe a powerful example of how pre-state societies could still achieve high levels of organization. When we look more closely at the animal carvings, we do not just see decoration. We see a mental universe. What looks aesthetic to us today may have meant much more to the people who created it. These images could have been warnings, protective symbols, parts of myths, signs of group identity. Perhaps they reflect an age in which the boundary between humans and nature was not yet sharply drawn. Because at that time, human beings were not masters of nature. They were creatures living inside it, dependent on it, afraid of it, and trying to understand it. A snake was a threat. A vulture could be tied to death. A predator meant power. A scorpion meant hidden danger. The world carved into those stones was both real and symbolic at the same time. That is one of the reasons Göbekli Tepe matters so much. It is not only architecture. It is a landscape of thought. A map of fear and belief carved into stone. Some interpretations suggest that the great central pillars at Göbekli Tepe may have represented important beings or central presences for the community. The smaller stones around them may have reflected a structured world arranged around that center. Perhaps people gathered there to think about the sky, death, ancestors, and the cycles of life. Perhaps the memory of the community was kept alive around those pillars. It is difficult to speak with certainty. Archaeology gives us objects, but the emotions and rituals inside those objects often remain partly hidden. Still, some conclusions are strong. Because no community builds a place like this for no reason. You do not create such a monumental arrangement simply to escape the rain. You do not invest so much symbolic labor in stone just for daily cooking. There is a clear sense of intention here that goes far beyond ordinary life. And that intention is one of the things that changed the course of history. Because it strengthens the idea that what makes humans human is not only tool-making, but also meaning-seeking. One of the most famous phrases connected to Göbekli Tepe is this: first the temple, then the city. Of course, that is a dramatic summary. Real life is never simple enough to fit into one sentence. But the phrase still matters, because it makes us think about how powerful shared sacred places can be in shaping social order. Imagine a community living in scattered groups, but gathering again and again in the same place. Such gathering requires food, human effort, planning, protection, communication, perhaps. These repeated meetings slowly encouraged more permanent ways of living. Perhaps some people began to stay there longer. Perhaps gathering and processing grain became more systematic. Perhaps the first sparks of settled life in the surrounding region grew stronger. In that case, agriculture may not have been the single first engine driving everything. Symbolic and social needs may also have helped push agriculture forward. That is where Göbekli Tepe throws its greatest challenge at traditional history. But the story does not end there. Because in recent years, interpretations of Göbekli Tepe have become more nuanced. At first, the site was often seen almost entirely as a ritual center, nearly a pure temple complex. But later, archaeologists also began to consider traces that may point to everyday activity beyond the monumental structures. This leads us toward a more balanced picture. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was not only a distant pilgrimage point used purely for ritual. Perhaps ritual and life were intertwined there. Perhaps there were both special ceremonial structures and areas of more ordinary use. This does not reduce the importance of the site. It actually makes it even more important. Because then we see a more human world. A world in which the sacred and the ordinary were not completely separate. A world in which ceremony, labor, food, gathering, and symbolic order existed together in the same landscape. And that shows us that the beginnings of human society were more layered than we once believed. History did not begin with a single switch being turned on. Everything developed together. And Göbekli Tepe offers a breathtaking picture of that transition. Another astonishing point is that some of the structures seem to have been buried over time. In other words, certain areas appear to have been deliberately filled in and covered, and later other structures were built. That suggests something more than ordinary abandonment. Perhaps this was a closing ritual. Perhaps a symbolic act marking the end of one phase. Perhaps a sacred space, after fulfilling its purpose, was returned to the earth. This idea suggests that the site was governed not only by practical logic, but also by ceremonial thinking. Imagine that. People not only building structures, but also giving meaning to the ending of those structures. Giving ritual meaning not only to beginnings, but to endings as well. That is an extremely powerful cultural behavior, because it means symbolically shaping time itself. And a community that does this cannot be called simple in any shallow sense. On the contrary, it suggests a serious mental world built around time, memory, and sacredness. Göbekli Tepe also changed our idea of what a center can be. For a long time, when people spoke of the center of civilization, they imagined cities. Fortified walls, palaces, written records, armies, markets. But Göbekli Tepe showed that a pre-urban center could also be immensely powerful. Sometimes a place does not need thousands of houses to become the center of a world. Sometimes shared meaning can make a place central. Perhaps for the people of that age, Göbekli Tepe was not just a hill covered with stones. Perhaps it was a special point where sky and earth touched, where the living and the ancestors met, where fear and hope were felt at the same time. If so, then explaining the birth of civilization only in economic or technological terms becomes incomplete. Because sometimes a center is first built in the mind and only later made visible in stone. Göbekli Tepe may have been exactly that kind of mental center. That is why it is not enough to describe Göbekli Tepe only with a sensational phrase like the world's oldest temple. Yes, the phrase is powerful. Yes, its monumentality creates a deep impact. But the real issue is this. The site shows us that very early human communities already possessed the capacity for abstract thought, cooperation, ritual, and symbolic order. This is not only a historical record. It is a discovery about human nature. Because if hunter-gatherer groups could build structures this complex, then human social intelligence and the power to create belief are far older and far deeper than we once imagined. And once that became clear, the entire early Neolithic period began to be seen differently. Other sites in other regions also started to be read through new questions. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe does not only tell its own story. It forces us to reinterpret an entire age. Perhaps the most powerful thing of all is the silence of the stones. Because there is no writing, they left us no direct explanation. There is no king's name, no priest's diary, no sacred book. There are only stones. And through those stones, we try to understand one of humanity's oldest dreams. That is what makes Göbekli Tepe both scientifically and emotionally powerful. Because what we have are not perfect answers, but powerful traces. And sometimes the thing that moves history forward is not the answer, but the question. That is where Göbekli Tepe's greatest strength lies. It does not only teach us that human beings could build great structures very early. No, it teaches us something deeper. That from the very beginning, humans were creatures searching for meaning. Creatures turning fear into symbol. Turning nature into story. Holding communities together through ritual. So why did all of this change the course of history? Because history is not only about knowing what happened in the past. History also shapes how we understand the present. If the foundation of civilization is only hunger, production, and material necessity, then civilization becomes mostly an economic story. But if shared beliefs, symbols, ceremonies, and sacred spaces also played a major role in the beginning, then civilization is also a mental and spiritual story. Göbekli Tepe placed that second possibility right in front of us with enormous force. And suddenly one question became much more important. What was the first thing that truly brought people together on a large scale? The need to fill their stomachs, or the need to build a shared world of meaning? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps one fed the other. But now we know this much. The old story was too simple. Humanity's beginning did not unfold in a straight line. When we look at Göbekli Tepe, we are also looking at ourselves. Because what we see there is not only the stone form of civilization, but the early courage of the human mind. To think big before cities existed. To leave a lasting mark before writing existed. To create common order before kingdoms existed. To make stone speak before metal existed. That is extraordinary. And perhaps that is what moves us most. Because modern humanity defines itself through progress. But sometimes a structure from thousands of years ago forces us to ask, what is progress really? More technology, bigger buildings, faster lives, or the effort to give meaning to the world? The stones of Göbekli Tepe ask that question silently, but insistently. In the end, Göbekli Tepe is not just an old hill. It is not just a tourist site. It is not just one of the oldest monumental places on Earth. It is a place that forced humanity to rewrite the opening sentence of its own history. Because every pillar, every carving, every carefully arranged stone circle seems to whisper the same message. Humans began thinking big far earlier than we once believed. Humans did not only want to survive. They also wanted to create meaning. They wanted to give shape to the unseen. They wanted to imagine a shared world. And that is what changed the course of history. Göbekli Tepe showed that the foundation of civilization was built not only on bread, but also on belief, imagination, symbols, and collective effort. And perhaps that is why, when we look at that stony hill, we do not only see the past, we also see one of the oldest secrets of what it means to be human.